us being a kind of a dependent on oil makes us vulnerable towards its downturns. What can we do to diversify Alaska's economy, if anything? And what do you make of the BP Hilcorp deal and Alaska's economic future?
I would hear from him first. You start.
Well, I'll start by saying I don't have any particular inside knowledge on the deal between Hilcorp and BP. In one way, it's sort of encouraging that another company would be willing to buy these assets for several $1 billion, right? And Hilcorp thinks they can come in here and extract more money from these legacy fields. They can do a better job than BP does, and their business model is quite a bit different. I think it's also worrisome, obviously, for Alaska because it's going to mean a number of layoffs. And BP has been a really important partner for a lot of people in our community. They've done a lot of charitable work. And the question is whether or not Hilcorp is going to continue with that. But that's kind of the micro level. I'd say on the macro level, what you said is absolutely true, which is we've long recognized that our economy is too dependent on oil and on certain extractive industries in general. And I don't think this is actually a controversial statement. I mean, I don't know. You said we're going to have disagreements. I'm not sure if we will.
Maybe a little bit further down.
The question
so far, so good.
Yeah, the question of diversifying Alaska's economy has been sort of the, what do we call it, the silver bullet, golden bullet, whatever it is. It's been the focus for a lot of Alaskans for 40 years, but no one has really hit on one thing. And I think what people have realized, policymakers have realized, is that there isn't one thing. There's no one single thing that can replace the oil industry.
Sure.
In terms of revenue for the state or even jobs for the state's residents. So I think it's going to be a combination of things. I think it's going to be tech, I think it's going to be services, I think it's going to be tourism, I think it's going to be continued sustainable fisheries, that kind of thing. But the other question we need to answer, it's not just about the jobs, it's also about revenue for the state, right? Because the state itself provides a lot of middle-class jobs in Alaska. And so far, our tax system is structured so only the oil industry has really been paying a significant portion of taxes. And that is going to have to change. Maybe not this year, but at some point in the not too distant future, we're going to have to diversify our revenue sources if we want to maintain a middle class and have a diversified economy.
Okay.
Mm. Yeah, well, I don't really have any unique insights on the Hilcorp deal, but it does, if the press, I'm remembering the press accounts correctly, most of their, how much of their employee force is in Alaska nationally? I think it's a majority, isn't it, or no?
Well, maybe nationally. So my understanding with Hilcorp is unlike BP that has a bunch of plays going at once, Hilcorp kind of focuses on one. I think the last one was in Papua New Guinea, and they're based out of Texas. Right, but it might be the case that I think Alaska is their next big play, and it will be sort of the primary focus of their company.
Yeah, I mean, when I read about it, my hope was, well, maybe the headquarters, or at least the virtual headquarters of the company, is going to move to Alaska, which would be good for the state, better than having Houston or London, sucking money out of the state like they've been doing for a while. So, I mean, almost everything that you said, I would agree with. That I mean, in a way, I don't like to demonize oil companies. There are neighbors, the people who work for them are our friends, neighbors, good citizens. The companies have contributed a lot to this state. Nevertheless, I do think, in a way, if you think about it dispassionately, I mean, oil in a way has been a curse of the state. It has been a curse, and in this sense, and I don't mean generally, but in the sense that, because it has biased reinvestment of finance and human capital towards it, it has meant that finance capital and human assets have not been invested in other new sectors of the economy that could have taken root and grown here. But this is what oil does all over the world. Right. See, because it's such a rich resource, you see when it's discovered in nations, they become a single resource economy practically, and it dominates everything else. And in a way, when you look at their economies, it kind of curses them in that sense as well. It's hard to have a diversified economy when you've got oil in your midst. So the question is, how do you do that? When I came here, I thought one of the ways to do that, I don't know if it can come from government. Leadership has to come from the private sector, and leadership from finance capital. They have to be willing to take those risks and invest in new businesses. And So anyway, I mean,
I think that's true. I think there are some examples of other, because not just oil, right? Oil is the most prominent example, but whenever there's sort of one extractive resource that is by far the most profitable, it tends to do this, right? The resource curse a bunch of different countries. But I do think there are models of countries that have done it better than we have. So Norway and Australia would probably be the two I would point to. And neither of them is perfect, but they have a more diverse economy and seem to have done a better job, particularly Norway, of reinvesting the wealth that came out of the oil companies, or the whatever the resource was. I think you're right. I think the other key point of that is oil. And look, we saw this obviously most prominently with Vico. They captured the Alaskan political system for a long time.
Right.
And you could argue about whether or not they still do. They have a lot of influence. And when you're setting up a tax structure, for example, there have been times in Alaska's political history where they're basically represented at both sides of the table, right? I mean, they have enough influence that we are supposed to do arm's length negotiations with these oil companies at times. You're right, there are friends and neighbors, but it's also a business transaction, and their headquarters is in BP's headquarters is in England, like you said, and so, but we are a small state with small population, and an oil company can drop $10 or $20 million here and fundamentally change the political structure of our state, and they have at times, and so it's going to be interesting to see what happens when that is hopefully no longer the case.